We're going to talk about the life of the legendary folk singer later in the broadcast. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest, Stephen Greenhouse, reporter for the New York Times and author of the book, The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker. Some people have been saying unions should be eliminated entirely from the public sector. This is Steve Forbes, the billionaire magazine owner and former Republican presidential candidate. He was interviewed on the Fox Business Channel.
I'm going to really put your feet to the fire here. Should we outlaw public sector unions?
We should do away with them. And well, why not? I mean, look what's happened. And this does not mean you're taking things away. As a matter of fact, if you properly start to reserve for these pensions, people who actually get a job in the public sector know that this is pretty good security. A lot of those people are going to discover they're not going to get the pension they were promised. They're going to get layoffs where they thought they weren't going to get layoffs. So they're going to end up, what did I get for these big promises?
Okay, but the question is, has the genie been let out of the bottle? Now that we have public sector unions, even though FDR had qualms about them, JFK did it.
Realistically, politically, they're not going to go. But there are a lot of things you can do, David. You don't have to ban them or anything like that. For example, dues. They should have a law making it very explicit. You have to give permission to use your dues for political purposes. They have to give better accounting. You start doing things, or you don't have to join a union. Right to work? Boy.
Republican lawmakers in at least 10 states plan to introduce legislation that would bar private sector unions from forcing workers they represent to pay dues or fees. This is Luann Ridgway, a Republican state senator from Missouri, also speaking on Fox News recently.
In Missouri, the bill that I'm working on right now would simply say that we want to work to save jobs in Missouri and also expand our job base in Missouri by saying that no worker should be forced to join a union. In other words, a good job should never be held ransom for the price of union dues. What we're trying to get to is to get Missouri on the map as a place where businesses want to be and where that they would like to locate. National siding corporations, frankly, they're taking a look at Missouri and saying, are you a right-to-work state or are you a forced union state? And as soon as they see that we are a forced union state, our applications, as a general rule, go on the ash heap. And the other states that are right-to-work states where they have a freedom to join or not join a union, they're going to the top of the list. We're losing out. And that means our people, our workers, our jobs are losing out, and that's just not workable.
And that was Luann Ridgway, Republican state senator from Missouri, speaking on Fox News. In addition to Stephen Greenhouse, reporter for the New York Times, we're joined by Michael Zweig, professor of economics and director of the Center for Study of Working Class Life at the State University of New York, Stony Brook, author of What's Class Got to Do with It and The Working Class Majority, America's Best Kept Secret. Juan?
Well, Michael, I'd like to ask you, there's this 1-2 punch that Steve was describing. On the right-hand punch is destroy the unions altogether. The left-hand punch is, well, these pensions and these other things are too costly for us right now. So we're not going to destroy the unions, but you're going to have to give up a lot of this stuff. Your reaction?
Well, you know, I think there's some idea that this is just an inevitable matter of arithmetic. Joe Scarborough the other day on Morning Joe said there's nothing ideological about this because, look, we have liberals doing this like Cuomo and Jerry Brown out in California. We have conservatives like Kasich. So there's really no ideological content to any of this attack on labor. It's just, look, there's no money. And I think that that's just completely wrong. There is, of course, an ideological content to it, which is a long story, a long history in the United States of capital and the corporate power resisting anything that labor needs, anything that labor wants. And in the New Deal, in the Depression, working people won a lot. And the business community never reconciled to that and has consistently attacked first the private sector unions, because at the beginning of this story in the 40s, 50s, 60s, there were no public sector unions. Public sector unions started organizing only in the 1960s. So now that the public sector is the majority of unions in this country, and the overall union membership has declined significantly from 35% in the 1950s, set 25% of workers in unions in the 1970s, and now it's 12%. And the majority of those are now in the public sector. The attack on anything having to do with worker rights is now focused on public sector unions.
And isn't it true also, because I'm old enough to remember that in the old days, 20, 30 years ago, pension funds, which were supposedly holding the money for the retirees that had already been paid into a system, were largely invested in safe securities, in bonds. It was usually 2/3 in bonds, 1/3 in the stock market. But over the years, as governments reduce their pension contributions, they encourage these funds more and more to invest in the stock market. So precisely when the market crashes, all these pension funds are, because now they are overwhelmingly exposed to the equities market, now suddenly find reporting historic losses now in the pension funds that now have to be made up. So you've got the very politicians who pushed moving these pension funds into the equities market are now having to deal with the consequences, but they want the workers to pay for it.
But they want the workers to pay for it. And the pension funds got built up as a substitute for direct wages. So it's not like these pension funds were on top of what the workers were getting and just icing on the cake. It was what was the very basic condition of work, which is when you're finished working, you need to be able to live. You know, the old saying, you're too old to work, but you're too young to die. What happens in that period? The labor movement historically has fought for those pensions, and those pensions have been given in trade-offs against current wages. And so what happened was that states contributed to those problems in the way you've described, but also they contributed because they just simply didn't fund the pension obligations that they had, thinking that's somebody else's problem, the old kick the can down the road. And here we are, and now all of a sudden it's the workers' fault, and it's just an outrage.
What's the danger of not having public unions represent workers?
The danger is that the workforce is shrunk, it suffers, and for example, if you shrink what goes on in Medicare and Medicaid, which is a big ticket item, and they want to come, and Cuomo here in New York was talking about, we have to do something about this Medicaid expenses. Cut them, cut them, cut them. Well, Medicaid is only for the poor, but if you cut those expenses for the poor, they're still going to show up in the hospital. So what's going to happen is the hospital is going to have to divert resources which would otherwise have gone to the general population in order to deal with the poor people who are walking in, unless they're just going to let them die on the street in front of the hospital, which we don't want. And so you have a situation in which if you have public sector workers stripped of their capacity to have unions and to protect themselves, their living standards will decline, the public services that people get will decline, and that's the whole idea. That's the agenda. This is not just a matter of arithmetic.
I wanted to ask Steve about this potential battle that you're talking about, the AFL-CIO is trying to now resolve between private and public sector unions. When Andrew Cuomo was inaugurated yesterday, he also announced that he is forming a committee to reform Medicaid reimbursements, because that's one of the huge portions of the state expenditures. And he named Dennis Rivera from SEIU and George Gresham from 1199 to that committee with the other business folks. There's a fear there that what's going to happen is that SEIU, which is basically New York representing private sector hospital workers, will arrange a deal with the governor and sacrifice the public sector hospital workers, those who work in the Health and Hospitals Corporation, who represent DC 37, who are represented by AFSCME. Any sense of how this may play out in healthcare, not just in between construction trades and some of the other government workers?
It's clear, Juan, that Cuomo is fairly close to 1199 SEIU, and he's kind of at war with the AFSCME government workers unions. And it won't be surprising if, with the heads of 1199 working with him on finding ways to trim Medicaid costs, that maybe the 1199 private sector healthcare workers will come out better than the AFSCME healthcare workers. I want to say one or two things about pensions. There are a lot of government workers who retire with pensions of $30,000, and it's hard to say that that's extravagant. But there are also public sector workers who retire with the famous stories of the California state troopers who retire with pensions of over $100,000. And some people on the left will say, nothing's wrong with the pension system, don't touch it. And some people on the right will say, everything's wrong with the pension system, public sector pension system is far too generous. And, you know, I'd gone to my high school reunion in Massapequa, Long Island a few months ago, and so there are all these friends of mine who were recently retired teachers at age 58, and they worked there 35 years, and they were getting pensions of like $80,000 a year, and if they live another 25 years, that's $2 million. And I think, wow, $80,000 a year, that's more than many New York Times reporters make. And I can imagine, you know, the struggling janitors in New York who are making $25,000, $30,000 a year who say, these teachers has a pension of $80,000 a year, and I'm busting my hump, earning $25,000, $30,000 a year. And I think, you know, there's this tension now where, you know, I think some private sector union leaders are feeling, you know, some upset among their rank and file, say, you know, why should we pay higher taxes to finance these generous pensions? So, you know, it all comes down, and I'm sure that the teachers who have pensions of $80,000 are saying, well, the real problem isn't our pensions. The real problem is Wall Street, and Wall Street caused the recession, and had, you know, stock prices not plummeted, and had you know, the governors of New Jersey continue paying into the pension fund rather than skipping payments for like 10 years, you know, there wouldn't be this crisis in pensions. So they'll say the problem isn't us, the unions. The problem is the Wall Street caused recession, falling stock prices, and you know, governors who didn't bother to make the proper payments. But you know, there are a lot of equities involved.